that the Ethiopian Bible is the oldest Bible. In fact, the oldest copy of the Ethiopian Bible, which is full in terms of a Genesis to Revelation copy, is 14th century.
For more than 1,500 years, a Bible sat hidden in an Ethiopian monastery, untouched by the rest of the world. Inside it is a post-resurrection story missing from every other gospel most people know. It wasn't banned, debated, or publicly erased. It was simply left behind.
This is a rare Ethiopian Orthodox Bible manuscript, handwritten in Ethiopia's sacred liturgical language, Ge'ez.
And once you see what this book preserved, the story of early Christianity starts to feel far less settled. The ancient Ethiopian gospel hidden in the mountains. High in the north of Ethiopia, the land starts to rise into long ridges and broken hills. The air turns cooler, the roads get rougher, and small farms cling to the slopes. A short drive east from the town of Adwa, up on one of these hills, there is a stone complex that has stood for well over 1,000 years. This is Abba Garima Monastery, home to one of the most surprising gospel books on earth. Monks here say daily prayers in old stone churches, while a short walk away, an ancient gospel book rests behind thick walls, wrapped, closed, and guarded. The area around Adwa sits at a little over 6,000 feet above sea level. The hills around the town roll away toward the high plateau of Tigray. For people who live at sea level, just walking up to the monastery is enough to leave them short of breath. For the monks, that climb is just part of daily life. They live in a place that feels far from the outside world, and that distance has helped them protect what they keep. Local tradition says the monastery was founded in the 6th century by Abba Garima, one of the 9 saints who came from the eastern Mediterranean to preach in the Old Kingdom of Aksum. Stories describe him as a holy man with healing powers who came from a royal background and settled in these hills. He and the other missionaries helped turn Aksum into a strong Christian kingdom, with its own churches, clergy, and sacred books. In this version of the story, Abba Garima did not just found a monastery, he also left behind a gospel book that would outlive kings, invasions, and empires. That book is what people now call the Garima Gospels. The name sounds like one single volume, but it actually refers to a small group of closely related gospel manuscripts. Today, 3 handwritten books from this monastery belong to the same family, 2 very early gospel codices and a later one from the medieval period. The 2 oldest volumes are often called Garima I and Garima II. Each one is a heavy block of pages written by hand in Ge'ez, the ancient church language of Ethiopia, and each one contains the 4 standard Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Every page is written on parchment, which is animal skin scraped thin, polished, and cut into sheets. In this case, the parchment comes from goats. The pages are thick and slightly yellow, with a smooth side and a rough side. The books were originally bound with wooden boards and rich metal covers, a style known as a treasure binding. These covers often include silver or other metals, and sometimes carry small crosses or engraved designs. They are not just there to protect the pages. They send a clear message that this is an object to honor, not just a tool for reading. For a long time, people outside Ethiopia had almost no idea how old these books really were. Some early visitors in the 1900s guessed that they were from around the 11th century or later. Others thought they might be close to the first millennium. The monks kept their own tradition, which said that Abba Garima himself wrote the gospel book in a single day and that God stopped the sun in the sky so he could finish before nightfall. It sounded like a legend that could never be checked. That changed when scholars were finally allowed to take tiny scraps of loose parchment to a lab in Oxford for radiocarbon dating. The tests surprised almost everyone. One sample, taken from an illustrated page in Garima II, pointed to a date between the early 4th and mid-6th century. Another sample from a different decorated page fell between the early 5th and mid-7th century. Later work supported a similar range. In simple terms, the manuscripts are now placed in the late 5th to early 7th centuries. That makes them around 1,500 years old and puts them among the very earliest surviving illustrated gospel books anywhere in the world. Because of that dating, these manuscripts may be older than famous Western gospel books, such as the Book of Duro or the Lindisfarne Gospels, by several centuries. They show that skilled Christian book art was already strong in the Ethiopian and Aksumite world, at a time when parts of Europe were still dealing with the breakup of the Roman Empire. The Garima Gospels are not copies of European books. They are evidence that this highland kingdom had its own script, its own painting style, and its own way of presenting the story of Jesus. The inside of the books is even more striking. Garima I opens with a long series of decorated pages known as canon tables. A canon table is a kind of chart that lines up which passages in one gospel match passages in the others. They are based on a system made by an early Christian writer named Eusebius, and they usually appear at the front of gospel books. In the Garima Gospels, these tables are framed by painted arches that look like small buildings, with slim columns and curved tops. The shapes echo the stone architecture of the Eastern Christian world, but the colors and patterns have a strong Ethiopian feel. Garima too has its own group of decorated pages, including full portraits of the 4 gospel writers and an extra portrait of Eusebius before his canon tables. In these paintings, Matthew, Luke, and John are shown facing forward in similar poses, while Mark is shown from the side, seated on a bishop's throne linked to the church in Alexandria. Bright reds, deep yellows, and fresh greens fill the pages. There is also a page that shows a building that may be the Temple of Solomon, or a fountain of life, with a staircase drawn in a way that does not appear anywhere else in Christian art. Even after so many centuries, the colors remain surprisingly vivid. Between these decorated pages, rows of black and red letters fill the parchment. The text is written in Ge'ez, using the distinctive Ethiopic script with its blocky joined characters. This was the written language of the Aksumite kingdom at the time and is still used in church services today. The layout of the pages, the order of the books, and the way headings are marked all show a clear, stable way of presenting the Gospels that must have been in use for a long time before these particular copies were made. Careful study of the pages shows that these books were not museum pieces. They were handled, read, and used in worship. Scholars have found later notes written in the margins, small instructions in red ink that tell the reader how to use a passage in a church service, and even corrections and repairs where pages were damaged and then mended. Some of these notes were written in a very old form of script, which suggests that the manuscript stayed in active use for many generations before anyone thought of them as fragile antiques. For centuries, almost all of this remained unknown outside the monastery. Women were not allowed into the inner area, and visiting men could only see what the monks chose to bring out. In the middle of the 1900s, a British visitor named Beatrice Plain saw some of the illuminated pages briefly, and guessed that the style looked very early and had links to Syria. Later, a French scholar, Jules Leroy, proposed a date around the 11th century based on what little he could see. It was only after microfilm photos were taken in the 1960s and later conservation work began that outside experts really started to grasp how old and how important these books were. In the 2000s, the Ethiopian Heritage Fund helped launch a serious conservation project at Abba Garima. Conservators like Lester Capon and Mark Winstanley traveled to the monastery and worked in very basic conditions. They had to undo damaged bindings, flatten and clean pages, and then rebind the books so they could be opened safely. At one point, they even used simple funeral stretchers as makeshift tables because there were no proper workbenches. Their work slowed down further decay and allowed better photographs to be taken for study. But that sense of safety did not last. When war reached the Tigray region, monks at Abba Garima reportedly rushed to hide the gospel books in nearby hills and caves, fearing that looters or soldiers might take them. And this single set of books is only one small part of what was kept in those highland churches and monasteries. To really understand why this gospel book matters so much, it helps to step back from this one hill and look at the much larger Ethiopian Bible that grew up around it. How Ethiopia built a different Bible. When most people talk about the Bible, they are usually thinking about the same set of books. In many churches, the Bible means 66 books for most Protestants, or 73 books for Roman Catholics. You have a certain Old Testament, a certain New Testament, and it feels fixed and closed. In Ethiopia, that basic picture is different. The Bible used by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is larger, older in some of its forms, and built around a different set of choices about what counts as sacred text. In the Ethiopian tradition, the main canon is often described as having 81 books. That includes 46 books in the Old Testament and 35 in the New Testament. On top of that, there is a broader group of extra church books that sit around the main canon, such as church law and teaching texts that still shape worship and practice. Put simply, it is a scriptural world with more shelves than many people are used to. The Old Testament is where the difference really jumps out. Alongside familiar books like Genesis, Exodus, and the Psalms, the Ethiopian Bible keeps several ancient works that dropped out of most Western Bibles. One of the most famous is the Book of Enoch. This is a long Jewish work that talks about angels who fall from heaven, giants who appear on earth, journeys through different layers of the sky, and scenes of final judgment. The full text survives only in the Ge'ez language in Ethiopian manuscripts, even though parts of it once existed in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. The Book of Enoch mattered a lot to some early Christian writers. A short part of it is even quoted in the New Testament letter of Jude, but later Western church leaders decided not to keep it in their official Bibles. In Ethiopia, the story went the other way. There, Enoch was copied again and again, treated as scripture, and read in churches for more than 1,000 years. Because of that, anyone who wants to study this book today depends heavily on Ethiopian copies. Another key book is Jubilees. This book retells the events of Genesis and part of Exodus with many extra details. It breaks human history into blocks of 49 years, called Jubilees, and gives a much stricter picture of law, Sabbath keeping, purity rules, and even the way time itself is measured. Most of the complete text of Jubilees also survives in Ge'ez, again thanks to the Ethiopian Church. Outside Ethiopia, it is usually treated as an extra or apocryphal work. Then there are the books called Maccabean, sometimes nicknamed the Ethiopian Maccabees. The name sounds familiar, but these are not the same as the Greek Maccabees found in Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Bibles. The three Maccabean books tell their own stories of people who stand up to idol worship, face cruel rulers, and stay loyal to God in the middle of pressure and threats. Their focus is not on a well-known Jewish revolt, but on moral examples, courage, and faith under trial. The Old Testament also includes works that are almost unknown to many churchgoers elsewhere, such as a book called The Paralipomena of Jeremiah, which adds stories tied to the prophet Jeremiah and other writings tied to wisdom, history, and worship. Different lists of the Ethiopian canon sometimes arrange these books in slightly different ways, but the main point is clear. Ethiopia kept a wider circle of ancient Jewish and early Christian writings and treated them as part of the same sacred library, not as side readings. The New Testament used in printed Ethiopian Bibles has the same 27 books most people know: 4 Gospels, Acts, the Letters, and Revelation. Around that, the wider Ethiopian tradition also uses several church law and teaching books. These include 4 works known as the Synodos, 2 books of the Covenant, a collection called the Ethiopic Clement, and a text known as the Didaskalia. These books lay out rules for bishops and priests, advice on worship, and guidance for daily Christian life. They function almost like an early church handbook that sits beside the New Testament. All of this is written in Ge'ez. The first translations of biblical books into Ge'ez go back at least to the 5th or 6th century, which makes this one of the oldest continuous Bible translation traditions in the world. Because the translations into Ge'ez were done early, they sometimes lock in a form of the text that is older than the Greek or Latin copies that later became standard in Europe. That is one big reason scholars care so much about Ethiopian manuscripts. When they compare a Ge'ez version with a later Greek or Latin version and see a difference, it can point to an older way the story was told, or a different detail that dropped out elsewhere. The ink used to write these books was usually made from soot mixed with liquids like water and gum from acacia trees, and sometimes with other natural materials. The text is usually written in black ink with headings, names, and holy words highlighted in red. Copying a book was not treated like a simple office job. In many monasteries, scribes trained for years to learn the script and layout. Some accounts describe them fasting or praying during the work. Each stroke of the pen was seen as both writing and worship. Even now, projects in places like Addis Ababa still teach people how to make parchment, grind ink, and copy Ge'ez texts by hand, keeping the craft alive in the 21st century. Once you see how much extra material is still alive in this tradition, a sharper question comes into focus. If Ethiopia preserved so many early books and readings, what happened to some of the stories about what Jesus said and did after rising from the dead that most people never hear about at all? The resurrection stories Ethiopia preserved. Most people hear the Easter story in a very short version. Women go to the tomb, find it empty, hear that Jesus has risen, and before you know it, the story is wrapped up. The shortest gospel, the Gospel of Mark, is the one that really pushes this to the limit. In the oldest Greek copies of Mark that we have, big handwritten books called Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus from the 4th century, the story stops at chapter 16, verse 8. The women are told to tell the disciples, and then they run away in fear and say nothing to anyone because they are terrified. Later Greek copies do something different. In many of them, after that fearful run from the tomb, there is a longer ending, from verse 9 to verse 20. In that ending, Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene, then to 2 followers on the road, and then to the group of disciples. He talks about preaching to the whole world, about belief and unbelief, and about signs that will follow the people who trust him. The same chapter, in some other old manuscripts, also has a much shorter wrap-up. Only a few lines that say the women did eventually tell the disciples, and that the message of salvation went out. That split has bothered people for a long time. Some researchers think Mark meant to stop at the fear and silence, to leave the ending open and sharp. Others think a last page was lost, and that later Christians tried to fix the gap by adding what they knew from other Gospels and from church teaching. Either way, the question hangs there. What did early Christians really read when they got to the end of Mark? When scholars started looking closely at Ethiopian copies of the New Testament, the picture became even more interesting. The Gospel of Mark was translated into Ge'ez many centuries ago, from Greek sources that were already in use when Christianity was still young in that region. When modern experts went through those Ge'ez manuscripts, including very old copies studied in detail in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, they found something striking. Every complete Ethiopian copy of Mark that they could check continues past verse 8 and includes the longer ending where Jesus appears to his followers. In dozens of those manuscripts, the story does not just jump from fear at the tomb to the long ending. The women flee in verse 8. Then there is the shorter wrap-up that says the message began to spread, and only after that do you get the full longer ending with the appearances and the sending out of the disciples. That shows that the people who copied these books in Ethiopia were not trying to choose between endings. They were doing their best to pass on everything they had received. They copied the fear and silence, they copied the short summary, and they copied the long scene where the risen Jesus speaks and sends. Very early Ethiopian gospel books, like the famous Garima manuscripts, follow this same pattern and carry Mark's longer ending after verse 8. That does not give a brand new ending to Mark. It does something else. It shows that, in the world that shaped the Ethiopian Bible, Christians were already reading Mark with those extra resurrection verses in place. For them, the story did not stop with frightened women running away. It moved on into meetings, commands, and promises from the risen Jesus. But in Ethiopia, the story after the resurrection did not live only inside the four Gospels. It also lived in other early Christian writings that most churches later dropped or forgot. One of the clearest examples is a work called the Epistle of the Apostles. Despite the name, it is not a normal letter. It is a 2nd century Christian text that tells the story of Jesus' life and then turns into a long talk between the risen Jesus and his followers. It is framed as a message from the 11 remaining apostles to churches, but most of it is a question and answer session where they ask the risen Jesus about faith, judgment, and the future. This writing was first composed in Greek, then translated into other languages, and then it vanished from view for many centuries. In the late 1800s, a damaged copy in the Coptic language turned up in Egypt. Only in the early 1900s did scholars publish a full text, based on a complete Ge'ez version found in Ethiopia. In other words, the only place where the whole thing survived from start to finish was inside Ethiopian manuscript tradition. What does the Epistle of the Apostles actually show? It places the apostles with Jesus after the resurrection, but before the final ascent to heaven. He shows them that he is still in a real body, not just a ghost. He talks about his birth, his suffering, and his rising from the dead. Then he warns them that false teachers will show up and try to twist the message with secret ideas and private inside knowledge. He tells them that his followers will face persecution, that there will be trials and trouble, and that he will return as judge. Another old work linked to the same world is often called the Book of the Resurrection of Jesus Christ by Bartholomew the Apostle. It survives in Coptic and Ethiopic and is sometimes grouped under the label Gospel of Bartholomew. This text also circles around the days after the crucifixion and the resurrection. In it, the risen Jesus reveals to the apostles what happened when he went down into the realm of the dead, how he broke the power of dark forces, and what that means for the fate of souls. It is full of questions from the disciples and detailed answers about unseen places and judgment. This is not part of the regular four Gospels, and it was never widely used in Western churches. But in the circles where it was read, including the Ethiopian tradition, it added even more detail to the time between the cross and the final farewell. Ethiopian Christians also kept a passion story in Ge'ez that hardly survived anywhere else, known as the Book of the Cock or the Book of the Rooster. It is a narrative of the last days of Jesus' life, written in late antiquity, that was still copied and used in later Ethiopian worship. It retells the story of the betrayal, the arrest, and the crucifixion by putting together pieces from all four Gospels and adding new scenes. In one famous passage, Jesus brings a roasted rooster back to life and sends it to spy on Judas when he is planning the betrayal. The bird comes back and tells what it has seen. Alongside all this stands a huge collection known as the Miracles of Jesus, or Teamra Iyasus in Ge'ez. It was translated into Ethiopic from Arabic in the 14th century and gathers many stories of Jesus' actions, from the announcement of his birth all the way to later events linked to his mother Mary. Different manuscripts include different sets of stories, but many of them were read on feast days and during special services. In this collection, Jesus is always moving, healing, teaching, and acting on behalf of his followers, even after his rising from the dead. It stretches the sense of his work beyond the brief scenes that many churchgoers know from a normal Sunday reading. All of this survived because people in Ethiopia kept copying and reading these texts when other communities stopped. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.